start of the session, I will be talking about the broad provisions of the input tax credit. Again, the objective is not to speak from a section or a legal perspective, but only to call out something which we have practically implemented over the last 3 years. And therefore, we'll try to keep the discussion as simplistic as possible, of course, covering most of the important aspects and controversies surrounding the input tax credit. I'll try to wind up my discussion by around 5:30 to 5:40. Input tax credit being a very important topic might mean that my session might get extended by 10 to 15 minutes more. After that is completed, we will open up the floor for questions from each of you. My request would be that your questions can come in the chat window. The Zoom has a feature called chat window. Even if you are on YouTube live for whatever reason, my suggestion would be that you go to Zoom for put the questions there, because otherwise it will be difficult for us to understand the questions which have been sent by you on the YouTube comment section. Therefore, please do not use the YouTube live comment section for the purposes of asking questions. Also, my request is that the Zoom window, please do not use it for any purpose other than the asking the questions, so that the questions do not get cluttered within lots of generic greetings and remarks. With that brief introduction, I wish you once again a very pleasant learning. And without much ado, we move to the discussion which we are planning to have today, which is on the core concept of GST, which is the input tax credit. And when we talk about input tax credit, my thoughts go back 3.5 years back, when we were really talking about introduction of GST. And just like the government was trying to introduce GST, there was a lot of discussion and the stakeholder consultations. And what we found was everyone in the country was eagerly awaiting for GST. And one unique selling proposition which the government had used to take the industry on board and try to convince them for such a landmark reform was the availability of input tax credit. Friends, make no mistake, pre-GST regime was a regime wherein we had fragmented duty structure and lots of restrictions on input tax credits. And one important reason which is also available in the constitutional amendment which was proposed for the GST law, the preamble to that constitutional amendment says that the whole objective of introduction of GST, amongst other things, is to remove what is known as the cascading effect of taxes. And in that perspective, I think today's topic becomes very, very relevant. It's all the more relevant in today's testing times, where every penny saved is going to add to your bottom line and also add to your cash inflows. And therefore, I think input tax credit as a topic is something which is very popular across various organizations, and it brings about lots of efficiencies in business models. What we will talk about today is, as I told you, not in terms of sections or rules or technical stuff, but we'll try to understand 5 broad areas under the input tax credit. One is, what is my eligibility for input tax credit as a registered person? In what all scenarios am I eligible for input tax credit? What are the general tests and conditions which I should test before I can even talk about claiming an input tax credit? That is the first area which we will talk about. Thereafter, we will talk about a scenario where we'll be talking about certain credits where, because of policy decision, the government is not interested in granting you any input tax credit, which we say is block credit. There is a section called section 17(5), and there's a long list of scenarios where the government says, because of policy decision, I do not want to give you credit. So we'll talk about those scenarios of block credit. Thereafter, we'll talk about specific situations of ineligible credits like restaurants and builders, where there is no eligibility of input tax credit at all. So we'll talk about those scenarios. Thereafter, we'll go into the apportionment of credits. And this is where you will find that SSCs who are having taxable as well as exempted outputs are required to calculate a ratio on a month-on-month basis and reverse a part of their credits based on that ratio. So we'll talk about the complicated formulas which are designed around that. And finally, the most important talk of the town, which has created a lot of difficulty across the entire scenario, is the matching principle or the principle of reconciliation. So we will be talking about that as well. And these are the broad grounds which we will be talking about today as we move into the specifics of the discussions. Now, the first point which we will talk about is relating to the general tests for the claim of the credits. And when we are looking at the general tests for claim of credits, I think few things which become very important there is, the first and the most important thing is that you should have received the goods and or services. And this again, of course, of late in certain businesses, this has become a little bit of a tricky proposition, because there have been a couple of new provisions which have been added to counterfeit what is known as fake invoicing or circular trading. The genesis of that comes from this test that you cannot claim the input tax credit of the GST charged by your vendors until you are able to demonstrate that you have really received the goods and services. In fact, there are huge penalties which have been cast both under the GST law as well as under the income tax law now, to, if in case you are engaged in something what is known as a fake trading or circular trading. So that is the first important aspect which we need to bear in mind, that as an SSE, we need to demonstrate the receipt of goods or services. The second and more important test is the requirement that the inputs or the capital goods or the input services, the goods or the services, should be used in the course or furtherance of business. Now, friends, make no mistake, under the earlier service tax or the central excise law, the requirement was that there has to be a nexus of your inputs or your input services or capital goods with a taxable output. And therefore, that requirement of nexus was much larger and much stronger under the older law. However, under the new law, it's not necessary that your individual input service or capital goods needs to be demonstrated to have been used for the purposes of providing a taxable output. So long as the expenditure is used in the course or furtherance of business, you are eligible for credit. So essentially, if you are a corporate entity, most of the credits, most of the expenses which are incurred by the organization would be used for the furtherance of its own business, and therefore should be eligible for credit. Of course, there are a little bit of gray areas which come up when you're looking at certain specific type of employee welfare costs. And when we go to the block credit list, we will talk about a few examples around that. And of course, there's a challenge around claiming the credit relating to CSR expenditure, because the Companies Act itself says that CSR expenditure is not something which is in the course or furtherance of business, or the company is not expected to incur a CSR cost in an area which is related to its business. So that is the second test which becomes relevant when you are claiming any input tax credit. The third, of course, is one of the basic tests, which is the fact that you should have received a tax invoice. And when we go into the documentation, you'll see that there are certain challenges which are coming up, especially because of the current scenario of COVID-19. And we'll try to deal with those scenarios when we go into that specific Rule 36, dealing with the underlying duty paying documents, which would make you eligible for the claim of the credit. The fourth condition, which has been largely misunderstood and to some extent it is a bit immoral, is the requirement that your supplier should have paid the tax. Make no mistake, something similar used to exist under the old VAT regime as well, and courts have time and again sustained this condition. When we go and talk about this condition to businesses and as clients, many of you have come back to tell me that how can we make sure that our vendor has paid the tax? It is the government who has issued a registration certificate to the vendor, and it is the government's responsibility through its chain of officers to enforce the vendor that he pays the tax. However, the government officers, when we discuss this in various representations, have a very clear thought process. They say, I can give you back the money only if I have got the money. If I have not got the money, I cannot give you back the money. So this is one of the very important conditions, that the vendor should have paid the tax. Make no mistake, there's a difference between a vendor having paid the tax and a scenario where the vendor has paid the tax but has not been able to upload it into your GSTR2A. Both of them are two diametrically different scenarios, of course, to some extent interdependent, but there could be many scenarios where the vendor has genuinely paid the tax but has uploaded it in the B2C section, or has not been able to file the GSTR1 because the time limit for the filing of GSTR1 is expired. This condition restricts itself to say that it is important that the vendor should have paid the tax. It does not talk about reflection of GSTR2A, for which we have separate rule called Rule 36.4, and we'll talk about the implications of Rule 36.4 at a subsequent point of time. A practical question which many clients ask us around this point is, how do we ensure at the time of the transaction that the vendor has paid the tax? I think at the time of the transaction, there is no mechanism to ensure this, because the payment of tax, as we all know, happens by the 20th of the next month. Therefore, what you can do is, in your purchase order or in your document contract, you can highlight this as a clause making the vendor liable to pay the tax. You might also say that we will withhold the payment up to at least the tax component till the time I see the vendor having paid the tax. As far as the vendor having paid the tax is concerned, you can take a certification from him, or either a certification or a particular type of response from the chartered accountant of the vendor, or maybe his GSTR 3B documentation, to make sure that he has actually ended up paying the tax. So the friends, that is the condition which says that you are required to make the payment to the vendor within the respective the vendor should have paid the tax to the central government or to the respective state governments. Friends, that takes me to the next point, wherein we have also seen certain show cause notices and emails being issued by the government, wherein the government has defined certain timelines for the claim of the credit. And as you all know, that all the credits for a particular financial year relating to the invoices which are dated a particular financial year have to be claimed by the September of the next year. And there are certain issues around that. When we go into that specific slide, we'll deal with it. And finally, the law also requires you to make the payment to the vendor within a period of 180 days. In fact, the section is negatively worded, and again we'll go into the specific issues around that as we move into the specific slide. But this, of course, is the curtain raiser slide, wherein we are bringing out, friends, the general tests for the claim of credit. And as you can see, there are 6 basic tests which you will try to incorporate and check each transaction for before you go ahead and claim the credit. Firstly, you should have received the goods or services, for which you will check your GRN. You will check, in case of services, whether there are sufficient service receipt notes. You will also check whether the expense is booked into your books of accounts, because if it is not booked into your books of accounts and it is recovered in some manner from some third parties, necessarily it would imply that effectively you have not received the goods or services. Therefore, the first aspect which you will have to always look at is receipt of goods or services, or the GRN. Used in the course of furtherance of business would basically mean that it hits either your P&L account or one of your assets which are depreciable assets in your balance sheet. You should have received a tax invoice, which is a documentary requirement. A vendor should have paid the tax, again obtain some challans from that. Credit is claimed within the defined timeline which has been mentioned under the law, so we'll look into those timelines. It has to appear in your GSTR 3B, which now is defined to be a valid return within those timelines. And finally, you have to make sure that you have made the payment to the vendor within 180 days. When we are talking about all of this, time and again, we keep on remembering that GST is not a pan-India law. It is a state-specific law, and therefore one legal entity might have more than one GST registrations. And when you have more than one GST registrations, the question which primarily again comes up is, which is the state where I will be eligible to claim the credit? And the answer to that would depend on the GST registration number which you have supplied to the vendor, and accordingly it will appear in the 2A of that GST registration. Ideally, to synchronize and align all your positions, it might also be important that the expense is disclosed in the trial balance of that particular state, or the books of accounts, or the state code of that particular state. When GSTR 2 was implemented for just 1 month, and that too partially for a few days, the GST portal somewhere suggested that if the place of supply is not the same as the registration state of the service recipient, then the credit is ineligible. Now, when you look at the GST law, there's nothing under the GST law which tries to bring out this type of an matrix. And therefore, there is a big question on whether the credit can be disallowed just because I am registered in Maharashtra and the supplier charges me some tax with a place of supply which is a state other than Maharashtra. This is something which will go through various litigation in the courts, and depending on the risk appetite of each client, a client will have to take a position in this regard. So friends, this summarizes the general tests for the claim of credit, and now we will try to look at some of them in a little bit more detail. And the first one which I would like to look at is the scenario where we are talking about receipts of goods and or services. And as I was highlighting, that this rule, this section has to be looked in contradistinction to 2 specific provisions which have been recently introduced. One dealing with fake invoicing, and highlighting that in case of fake invoicing, there could be a penal consequences, including imprisonment on the beneficiary of the fake invoice. And secondly is circular trading. Now, in both these scenarios, we also have a rule 86A, which permits the commissioner to block the utilization of credit. And when all these things happen, and many a times all of these things happen based on merely a sort of a affidavit which has been filed by your vendor, saying that, look, I have just given an invoice on a statement on oath. He might just say that I have given an invoice and I have not supplied the goods. Now it ultimately becomes his word versus your word. And in those types of scenarios, it may be important to understand what all things will be really relevant and how you can look at this scenario from the perspective of defending your genuineness of the transaction. Of course, there cannot be one specific type of a scenario which you will look at, but there are multiple things which you will look at. And when you're looking at that, some judgments from the excise domain, because this has been an issue under the excise law also, where the receipt of goods in the factory was important before you could claim the credit. So I've just tried to cull out a few decisions from the excise law, and all of this may be useful in those specific scenarios. But only thing which I can tell you here, friends, is that as time progresses, especially once the lockdown is overcome, you will have a lot of pressure, revenue pressure on the government. There would be a business pressure on the SSEs. Therefore, the tax collections would fall down. There might be some relief packages announced by the government. At the same time, their targets would still be there. And therefore, you might see a lot of actions happening on this front. And therefore, please be a little bit careful in all these types of scenarios. Please make sure that you have sufficient documentation, corroborative evidences to suggest that you have received the goods or services. That takes me to the next aspect on this area, which is the proper tax paying documents and the existence of a proper tax paying documents for the purposes of Rule 36. Now, when we are looking at that aspect, primarily the tax invoice is a document, and that tax invoice is defined under Rule 46. And most of the times when we did the implementation, we made sure that all the requirements which are mentioned under Rule 46, when you process of an invoice of a vendor, you should make sure that all those requirements are there on the invoice. Now, while we are generally looking at it correctly from the perspective of forward charge, we should also note that in case of reverse charge, and as you know, reverse charge mechanism can be from a registered dealer or it could be from an unregistered dealer. Now, if the reverse charge transaction is with a registered dealer, the registered supplier is still expected to issue a tax invoice. As of today, he is expected to upload that tax invoice in the GSTR1, and that tax invoice becomes your duty paying document. Now, this becomes very important when we will be looking at certain timelines for the claim of the credit. Now, of course, in forward charge, there could be a subsequent debit note which could also entitle you for a credit. There could be a credit note which could reverse some of the credits which you have claimed under the forward charge. In case of URD transactions for RCM, you are expected to raise an invoice yourself under section 31(3)(f). It's a self-generated invoice. We always say that a tally generated document or a ERP generated voucher can substitute for this self-generated invoice if sufficient information is kept in that. So your own document becomes the tax-paying document. Please note the challan of payment is no longer a tax-paying document. Under the service tax law, the challan of payment was a tax-paying document, but under the GST law, the invoice is a tax-paying document even for RCM. For registered dealers, it is the tax invoice of the supplier, and in case of unregistered dealers, it is the self-generated invoice which is raised by the recipient, which becomes the tax-paying document or the duty-paying document on the basis of which you will claim the credit. Then there is a bill of entry in case of import of goods, and if you are registered as an input service distributor, then the ISD invoice becomes a duty-paying document. So either of these documents becomes the basis on which you will be claiming the credit. There is thereafter under Rule 36 a proviso which says that unless the document is perfectly prepared as required under the law, you will not be, that document will be treated as a deficient document and you will not be eligible for credit. However, that sub rule has a proviso, and that proviso is very important, which I have reproduced here. It says that provided that if the said document does not contain all the specified particulars, please note this is very important, and this is important not from the supplier's perspective but from the recipient's perspective, because as a recipient today we get lots of queries saying that we have received an invoice because the vendor is not able to courier me a physical invoice which is properly signed. He generates an invoice, a scanned invoice, and emails it to me, and whether I can honor that invoice and whether I can claim the credit in this COVID situation. And I think that is where this proviso to Rule 36(2) becomes very relevant. I'll read it once again. It says that provided that if the said document does not contain all the specified particulars but contains the details of the amount of tax charged, description of goods or services, total value of supply of goods or services or both, GSTN of the supplier and the recipient, and place of supply in case of interstate supply. So friends, these are the minimum details which has to be there in the documents. So long as these minimum details are there, the proviso says input tax credit may be availed by such registered person, and therefore it's a very welcome amendment. I am not saying that this document is fully correct, but even if it's a deficient document, if it contains the essential features which are required therein, then it would be the eligible document basis which you can claim the credit. You can also refer to section 241 which defines a document to include document electronic records under the Information Technology Act. Also, Section 145 says that any information which is stored electronically in any device or media shall be deemed to be a document for the purposes of this act. And so in summary, what one can perhaps take a view is, so long as there's a physical document which will follow later, which is a perfect document, in the interim, if you have a scanned copy which is available and which contains only these minimal details, that could still be an eligible duty paying document on the basis of which you can claim the credit, and subsequently you can chase the vendor and get a perfect document which is to the letter T, which is required under the GST regulations. So in that sense, I think this provision becomes very, very important. In the initial slide, we had also talked about the timelines for the claim of the credit. And when you look at the timelines, there is section 16.4, which deals with the timeline. And it says that when you are claiming any credit in respect of an invoice which pertains to a particular financial year, the credit for that would by general be claimable by the due date of filing the return for the September of the subsequent financial year. Therefore, as you can see, for financial year 18-19, the due date for the September 19 return is 20th October. Therefore, for any invoice which bears a date between the for the financial year 18-19, you have to make sure that you claim the credit for that invoice prior to 20th of October 2019 in the GSTR 3B. Same way 1920, the date will be 20th October 2020. As far as 17-18 is concerned, because it was the first year of GST implementation, we had extended the due date by saying that it will be the due date of filing the return for the month of March 19, and therefore for 17-18, the timeline for the claim of input tax credit was 20th of April 2019. Now, of course, this says that the credit should be claimed in the 3B within that period. The law is not very, very clearly using that word in the 3B, and therefore there have been certain challenges which are coming up. In a couple of situations which we faced, we had a scenario of a credit for 18-19 claimed in the month of March 19, but the return for March 19, because the SSC did not have funds, was filed sometime after October 19. And the department then interpreted these provisions to say that because the March 19 return is filed in the month of November 19, which is after the return which is for September 19, I will not grant you the credit and the entire credit will be disallowed. There's a long history behind it, but I would primarily believe that this time sorry, I got disconnected for a minute. I think I am now connected. There was some technical issue. Uh, we are told that I have to restart from the GST credit time. I presume now you are able to hear me. If you are not able to hear me, please let me know and we will resolve this issue. Am I audible? One of you can please put it on the message. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So I will continue from this slide, and sorry for this technical glitch. As I was highlighting, we are looking at a scenario where section 16.4 brings about a case of a timeline for the claim of the credit. And what it broadly says is, if you are claiming the credit on the basis of any invoice, then you have to look at that invoice date. If that invoice date pertains to a particular financial year, the credit for the same can be claimed latest by the due date of filing the return for the month of September immediately following that financial year. Therefore, for 1819 and 1920, the due date for filing the September returns is 20th of October, and therefore all the credits where the invoice date is relating to 1819, you might have accounted it in your books in 1920, make no mistake. But if the vendor's invoice date is 1819, you have to claim the credit before 20th of October 2019. Similarly, for 1920, you are required to claim the credit before 20th of October 2020. For financial year 17-18, there was a very specific relaxation, and because of that relaxation, we were eligible to claim the credit up to the month of March 2019, filing of return for March 2019, which was due on 20th of April 2019. Friends, the issue which comes is there are various types of credits which are being claimed, and there are lots of doubts on what all cases will these provisions become applicable. And because as we saw under Rule 36 earlier, that the duty paying document is primarily an invoice, and Section 16.4 also deals with the provisions being applicable where the credits are claimed on the basis of invoices, you will find that this rule will apply not only to cases where the vendor has charged you the tax under forward charge, but also cases where the vendor has charged you the tax under reverse charge, or in cases where the vendor is not registered and you have yourself discharged the tax under RCM, under the reverse charge. In all those three cases, the section 16.4 will become applicable. In the first two cases, you will look at the invoice date as is reflected by the vendor. However, in the third case where URD RCM is applicable, as I was highlighting, there's a requirement of a generation of a self-generated invoice, and based on the self-generated invoice, you will be eligible to claim the credit in the relevant financial year for which that invoice is dated. So essentially, we had this huge conundrum when we did the audit for the first financial year 17-18, wherein at the time of audit we found out scenarios where the client had not paid certain taxes on import of services or under RCM, and when we advised them to make the payment, the immediate question was whether this is eligible for credit having paid that right now. Interest of course was not eligible, but whether the basic tax itself could be eligible, and based on the interpretation of section 37(3)(f) and your section 16.4, a generic view was that the credit is not eligible. However, if you make a non-compliance of 31(3)(f) and issue a invoice, a self-generated invoice of the current date, one can try to take a chance and say that it was a non-compliance under 31(3)(f), and the penal consequence for that could be a amount of 10,000 rupees, which is a general penalty. I cannot be denied outrightly the entire credit. So that is something which is an area which will have to be tested as time progresses. Since for import of goods, you are claiming the credit based on bill of entry, this provision of section 16.4 does not apply, because there the invoice is not the duty paying document, and therefore this provision does not apply. And finally, one question which regularly keeps on coming is, I have claimed the credit and I have reversed it for various reasons. One of the reasons could be I have not paid the vendor within 180 days, and therefore I have reversed the credit. Later on, when I reclaim that credit, whether this time limit will apply, and the answer is clearly no. There's a very specific rule under the GST rules which says that this provision applies only to the first time claim of credit and not to a reclaim of a credit which has already been reversed. And it is in this background that we had in the first year of implementation suggested to most of our clients that when you do a 2A and a 3B reconciliation, a 2A and books reconciliation, and you find that for a particular financial year, there are entries in 2A which have not appeared in your 3B and in your books, the first advice was that you force your vendor teams, the payment teams, to actually find out the transaction and book the invoices wherever they are pending for booking. And of course, if that happens before September, there's really no issue at all, because you are eligible for the claiming the credit till the month of September return. However, in cases where you are not able to do that, what we had suggested was, for all these credits which are appearing in 2A, but not appearing in your books, as on 30th September, pass a contra entry, claim the credit on that day, and immediately reverse the credit. And thereafter, whenever you reclaim the credit because the invoice is booked and paid, at that point of time, necessarily you will be eligible to claim the credit because of this rule. And many of our clients have implemented that rule. It's a good workaround to not lose that credit. Credit is, as I was highlighting in the start of my discussion, credit is a very important aspect of the entire GST law, and it is where the entire efficiencies of the businesses come in, and therefore somebody would be wanting to look at it from that perspective as well. That takes me to the next aspect, which is relating to the payment to the vendor. And here, when we look at that provision, the proviso basically says that once you claim the credit, make no mistake, you are eligible to claim the credit the day you book the transaction in your books of accounts, you have received the invoice and you receive the goods or services. However, it says that once claim the credit, if you do not make the payment to the vendor within 180 days, and the words used are where the taxpayer fails to pay to the supplier within a period of 180 days. And we'll understand this meaning of the word fails to pay a bit later. So essentially what they say is if you have not paid to the vendor within 180 days, then for all these unpaid transactions, you have to reverse the credit. Now, when you're looking at the scope of that provision, unlike the earlier slide, in this case, there's a very specific exclusion for tax paid under reverse charge mechanism. So in case of reverse charge mechanism, the day you pay the tax, you claim the credit immediately. Even if you don't pay to the vendor thereafter, there's no requirement of a reversal. The 180-day test does not apply to reverse charge mechanism. However, it does apply to import of goods. So unlike the earlier provision of timeline where it was applicable to RCM but not applicable to import of goods, here we have an exactly reverse scenario where the 180-day test is not applicable to RCM but applicable to import of goods. These are subtle differences which we may need to bear in mind. When we are looking at the 180-day test, a simplistic scenario would be we'll prepare an Excel chart wherein you will have your SEDVAT register or the ITC register. In that, you will plot the vendor payment date, and then we will do a calculation to see whether 180 days have expired. And if 180 days have expired, then we will reverse the credit along with interest, of course, because the law requires you to reverse that credit along with interest. However, when you look at the technical side of it, some certain scenarios come up. And one common scenario which comes up in contracting industry is that the contractors, when they make a payment to a subcontractor and when the clients make the payment to the contractors, generally there's a retention clause to make sure that the quality of the work which has been done is correct. And that retention clause would apply for a period of 2 years or many times even an extended period. In many cases, the company says that I want to enter into a scenario where I'll give you a credit of more than 6 months. In these scenarios, whether there is a requirement for reversal, and in our view, the meaning, the word used in the provision is fails to pay. Fails to pay is a stronger word, and therefore it will apply where you are contractually required to pay but you do not pay. Therefore, in cases where the vendor itself has given you an extended credit period like 8 months or 9 months, or where there is a retention money which is due after 1 year or 2 years, in that case, this clause is not triggered and there is no requirement for reversals. As far as book adjustments are concerned, I think there are already a couple of advanced rulings which say that book adjustments would be deemed to be payment, and therefore all adjustments done through journal vouchers, etc. You need not physically pay. If there's a vendor who is also your customer, you can just knock off the internal balances and that would be as good as deemed payment being made between the two parties. For deemed supplies, there is a clause which says that there is anyways the consideration is not there. Therefore, like branch transfer, there's anyways no question of a consideration. And if there's no consideration, there's no requirement to make a payment. And therefore, this test does not apply in such cases of deemed supplies like your branch transfers and supplies to agents or supplies to related parties without consideration. So this is, I think, the 180-day test which we have to bear in mind. With this, friends, we summarize the first part of our discussion, wherein we laid down 6 functional tests or conditions before you become eligible for credit. Now we move on to the second part of our discussion, wherein we will be talking about what all are ineligible credit, what in the legal parlance we say is blocked credits. And for this, we have section 17.5, which lists down an exhaustive list of credits which are not eligible. Of course, what I have tried to summarize here is only important aspects of those block credits and not all the block credits at all. So here what we are going to talk about is examples where credits are not eligible. And very loosely put, if you look at this list, you will find that lots of these entries find the shape from the earlier law, or even under the Senvet credit rules, most of these credits were blocked or were ineligible. Now, what is that list? Firstly, if you are buying any motor car or any motor vehicle for a passenger transportation, the credit is not available. Of course, there has been an amendment effective from February 19, wherein we are told that if the vehicle has a capacity about 13 passengers, then the credit will be available, and therefore basically the mini buses and the buses, the credits will be available if you are even buying them for passenger transportation. But for your motor cars and those types of assets, you will not be eligible for credits. Similarly, vessels and aircrafts, if you are buying for your self use, then credits are not available. It's not only that the purchase of these fixed assets disentitles you for credit. Any services connected with such fixed assets also will not be eligible for credit. You might be having insurance which has been taken for that motor car. There might be repairs cost of that motor car, or you might have taken that motor car on a lease or a hire. In all such cases where there are services connected with these ineligible assets, fixed assets, which are in the nature of motor vehicles or vessels or aircrafts, even those credits would not be eligible to you. Somewhere the government feels that food is not a priority. Therefore, we are told food and beverages will not be eligible as a credit outrightly. So all restaurant services, and most of us are aware that anyways we are not eligible for credit for that. So all food related cost is not eligible for credit. Make no mistake, it's only the food and beverages which are not eligible as credit. If you are having an in-house pantry or a canteen and you buy various assets, like let's say a coffee maker or a certain crockery, in that case all those assets would be eligible for credit. It's only the specific food and the beverages which will not be eligible for credit. The biscuits which you buy or the aerated water which you buy will not be eligible for credit. Thereafter, if you have a rent-a-cab services, that will not be eligible for credit, and there you have all scenarios of tourist vehicles, which are tourist cars which are taken for a one-day hire or a two-day hire, or even an example of a Meru or an Ola, Uber. All those credits will not be eligible. Thereafter, we have specified employee-related services like Mediclaim, group Mediclaim. Then you have your clubs, you have your gyms. All those credits are not eligible because they believe that these are all credits which are primarily related to the employees. Thereafter, construction-related services are not eligible for credit, and this is something which is very commonly asked as a question. Here, whenever you are looking at any construction-related cost, any civil structure or anything like that, I think there are three tests which we pass them through. Firstly, you ask a question whether it is an resulting into something which is an immovable property. If you are ending up with something which is movable, especially when you get an interior activity done, you might have chairs, you might have various computers which you will buy, or various assets which you will buy which are movable. In case of movable assets, this restriction does not apply. The credit is available. The end result has to be immovable if the item has to go within the block credit. Just being immovable is not enough. It should also not be something which is in the nature of plant and machinery. And now, depending on each case, you might cull out the exclusions for plant and machinery. A very common example would be central air conditioning. And we would say that air conditioning is a machinery. And therefore, even if that centralized air conditioning is ultimately affixed into an immobile property and therefore becomes an immobile property, even then the credit will be allowed. And finally, in case of renovation and repairs, the credit will not be allowed only if it is treated as a capital asset in your books of accounts, if it is capitalized in your books of accounts. If you are going to write it off in your P&L account as a regular repair cost, then credit is allowed. So therefore, when we look at this clause, we typically look at three important conditions within the construction ineligible credits. One is immovability, movable versus immovable. Second thing is plant and machinery versus others. And thirdly, capitalization versus revenue. And based on a cumulative satisfaction of or non-satisfaction of these three tests, we decide on eligibility or ineligibility of credits relating to this entry. Thereafter, we have an entry which says goods and services which are meant for personal consumption are not eligible as a credit. Again, this is in contradistinction to our positive condition, which said that the goods or services should be used for the furtherance or in the course of business. And this is necessarily a contradistinction to that. And finally, we are told, and if any goods are lost, stolen, destroyed, written off, disposed by way of gift or free samples, in that case, it will not be eligible as credit. So these are generic types of block credits. Then there are specific block credits in case the vendor has charged you under composition or you are under composition, or the tax has been paid consequent to issuance of a show cause notice. And because they are very specific, we will not go into those specific areas, but these are some areas which are commonplace, and you will look at ineligibility from this commonplace credits perspective. We now go to the next aspect of input tax credit, which again is very important and a fairly mathematical and complex, I would say, which basically is section 17.2, which deals with a scenario where you are providing both taxable as well as exempted supplies. Now, necessarily the government does not want to give you the credit in relation to exempted supplies because there is no cascading impact. And therefore, even under the service tax law, we had rule 6.3, and under the GST law, we have this rule 42, which deals with those types of situations where we will talk to you. And those situations broadly are dealing with cases where you are having both taxable as well as exempted supply. They've given a very complicated method, and I'm sure many of our clients would have put it in a correct matrix. But before we go into this matrix and the formula, I think concept we need to understand. What they are saying is, you use a general rule of mathematics, which is the rule of apportionment. But before you go into that apportionment, what you need to do is you need to create two baskets. Firstly, identify a basket where you will, if the input is used purely for taxable service, necessarily there is no exemption and there is a cascading, so you will get full credit. Put that in one basket, which is we will now say is T4 over here. So here you don't apply any ratio, you claim the entire credit. Second scenario is a scenario where you have an input credit which is used for providing an exempted activity. And if you are doing that exempted activity, necessarily you're not paying any output tax, so you should not get any credit. And that we will say is an example of T2. So T2 will take examples where you are not eligible for credit at all because it's exclusively used for exempted supplies. T4 is a scenario where you will be eligible for full input tax credit because you are exclusively using it for taxable supplies. And then you will have something which is a residual common credit. These are expenses which are common. Examples like rent, examples like auditors' payments, telephone bills. These are all common expenditures which will be used for both taxable as well as exempted supplies. They are saying for this type of common credits, you will have to use a ratio of a exempted supply to the total supply. So E divided by F, and you will apply that ratio, and accordingly you will reverse the credit which has been claimed, and therefore effectively you will get a proportionate credit. So this is how you are expected to do. Of course, you are required to do this on a month-on-month basis, and at the end of the year, you will have to rework the ratio based on the actual calculations for that particular financial year. So this is what you have to look at rule 42. There is also rule 43, which deals with capital goods and which has a even more complicated formula. I don't think we'll go into rule 43 into detail into this preliminary session. If you have any examples like that, we'll take it up offline at some another point of time. But it's important to understand what all is covered under your exempted supplies and your taxable supplies. And this table tries to explain you what is covered where. So friends, wherever you are charging a tax, let it be a supply of a taxable goods or a supply of taxable services, all of that clearly falls within the classification of F, and therefore your credit should be available. This would be your taxable supplies. Make no mistake, if you are exporting goods, you might export goods or services without payment of tax against an LUT. You might supply to an SEZ unit against an LUT without payment of tax. In all these cases also, despite you not having paid the tax, this will be treated as taxable supplies. And that's the beauty of zero rated supplies, that you don't want them to pay the tax as well as claim the credit. They should be eligible for claiming the credit. And therefore, all these cases will be treated as taxable supplies. One interesting dimension here is supply of exempted goods which are in the nature of zero rated supplies would also be treated as taxable supplies. So for example, if you are a commission agent of agricultural produce, and if you are exporting that services, in that case, that would be treated as a zero rated supply, and therefore you will be eligible for the credit even though the underlying product itself was not eligible for credit if sold domestically. Supply of exempted goods and services in the domestic market clearly would be exempted supply. Now exempted goods, as you know, comes under the nil rate of schedule. Exempted services comes through the notifications. Those notifications could be general notifications or specific notifications. If you are not paying tax on your output side, they would become a part of your exempted supplies, and it would become a part of your calculation for the purposes of the ratio calculations. Thereafter comes one-off transaction which you might have is a sale of a land or a building. Here we are told that such type of a sale of land or building will be defined as exempted supply, and the value for the purposes of calculation of ratio will be treated as a stamp duty valuation. This is a very chaotic type of a provision, and if you are having a scenario of a sale of a commercial building or something like that, you might end up with a huge impact on your common credits which you are claiming. If you have this type of a scenario, it's important that you discuss to your respective partner in charge or to me, and we try to work around a scenario of ensuring how the credit reversals are kept to the minimal possible extent. The next one is something where we, most of us at the time of introduction of GST have discussed this and debated this a lot. There is a provision which deems any transactions in securities or a sale of securities to be an exempted supply, and 1% of the sale price is deemed to be the value of the exempted supplies, and this results in a huge reversal in case of organizations which have some temporary cash surpluses and are active in the treasury market, maybe money mutual funds or in shares they regularly invest and disinvest from shares. In those cases, there are some challenges which come up because of this provision. Finally, supplies which are covered under reverse charge, for the purposes of the supplier, this will be treated as an exempted supply. Make no mistake, if you are a supplier who is supplying under a reverse charge mechanism, for example, if you are a transporter, you have certain transactions which are under forward charge, certain under reverse charge, and you are not paying tax on that reverse charge. In that scenario, this applies. This does not apply to your expenses. This applies only to your income. Finally, we have certain concessions. We are told that interest, even though you don't end up paying a tax and it's an exempted consideration towards an exempted supply of lending, it will not be considered as exempted for the purposes of expense of ratio or for the purposes of reversal of CENVET credit. Similarly, ocean freight will not be considered as exempted, and scheduled 3 transactions, which is basically your out and out supplies and high seas transactions, will not be considered as exempt for the purposes of reversal of credit under the provisions of Rule 42 and 43. So based on this table, you will on a month-on-month basis calculate the value of your taxable supplies. You will also calculate the value of your exempted supplies, and you will find a ratio and you will apply that ratio to the common credit. Whatever is your exclusive credit towards a taxable or an exempted supply, you will treat them accordingly. You will either claim full 100% credit or claim 0% credit. And for all the common credits, you will calculate a ratio. It may be around 60%, 65%. Randomly, it could be anything. Whatever be that ratio for that month, basis that you will claim the credit for the common credits. This is how the entire Rule 42 applies. Now, when we are looking at this Rule 42, we also need to bear in mind certain special scenarios, and 3 special scenarios which are industry specific we will deal with. The first scenario is restaurants, and as you know, there has been a lot of to and fro in the case of the taxes on restaurants, but ultimately from 14th of November 2017, restaurants have been placed under the basket of 5% without input tax credit, and that notification clearly says that you will not be eligible for input tax credit. If you are a pure play restaurant, necessarily this entire topic of discussion today is irrelevant. But most of the cases, you will be a restaurant and you might also have certain other services which are taxable services. And if you are a mixed supplier, necessarily you would want credits for your common overheads. When you are claiming the credits for the common overheads, your restaurant supplies will be treated in your exempted basket, and the credit will be available only in the ratio of the normal services versus the restaurant services. That is what would be the implication of the notification and the explanation which has been granted under the said notification. As far as real estate is concerned, from 2019, we have a very specific mechanism wherein affordable housing is now taxed at 1% without input tax credit, and normal residential housing is taxed at 5% without input tax credit. In both these cases also, the sale of completed flats, there is no tax, as you know, because it's after the occupation certificate. And all these 3 scenarios will be considered as exempted supplies for the purposes of reversal ratio. Now, real estate, of course, as you know, generally does works on a long-term basis rather than a month-on-month basis. And therefore, from 2019, only for real estate, we have brought in a scenario where the reversal will be based on a project, not on a legal entity or a registered entity, but a project-wise, and based on the carpet area of exempted supplies and carpet area of taxable supplies. For banking and financial services, entities which are covered by this sector, the ratio is to be fixed at fixed 3%. And of course, it's an optional mechanism. Either they can go at the actual ratio calculation, or they can treat 50% as the ratio, which will be a standard ratio for expense of purposes. More our experience is in most of the cases, the banks prefer to have it at 50% rather than going to the complicated calculation mechanisms. That takes me to the sequence of utilization, and of course this is portal generated, and it is going to work in a particular manner. There is a fungibility rule. What we are told is your IGST credit has to be exhausted first. Firstly, it will be utilized against IGST. Thereafter, after utilizing everything against IGST, if there's any pending IGST credit, it can, at your choice, be used either against CGST or SGST. If you have certain transition credits coming in, you might want to equalize the effect by selectively using C or S. Only important thing here is you have to first exhaust your IGST credit before you can move ahead. After that, you will exhaust your CGST credit, which will be against your CGST output. If after that there is an overflow in CGST and there is still IGST output, you can use it against IGST, and SGST to be used against SGST. The original thought process that C and S cannot be cross-utilized continues, and there is no relaxation against that. Only important point now is that your IGST balance has to be exhausted before you even go to exhaust your CGST or SGST. Therefore, you'll find cross-utilization of I towards C before your C towards C. Now, that is the change which has happened from the earlier law of utilization of credits, which we used to keep on discussing earlier whenever we were at the implementation stage. And that takes me to the last major discussion point, and which has actually kept a lot of sleepless nights for many people, which is relating to ITC matching and reconciliation. And when GST was introduced, we have kept on saying that this is entirely a reconciliation game, and everyone has just had nightmares on this reconciliation. The original workflow which the government talked about was about having a GSTR 1, 2, 3. For various reasons, that did not get implemented, and we stopped at GSTR 1 and 2A, and we have a summary return in the form of 3B. And therefore, the legal sanctity of this entire reconciliation exercise itself is in doubt. There is a stay granted by the Delhi High Court saying that there is no process of this reconciliation or a matching of 2A with your records, with your books of accounts. In fact, if you look at GSTR 9C, which is the audit report, it totally stays away from talking about GSTR 2A. And even the annual return only talks about lapsing of credit in case there is a more credit in 2A and less credit which is available in your books. However, if you have a scenario of more credit in books and less credit in 2A, it just makes a negative figure, but it does not require any specific consequence on that. Now, I'm sure when I'm talking about all of this, you are going to say that every month we keep on getting emails and notices from the department. But when you look at the legal position, this was the legal position before Rule 36.4. And we, in many cases, we had given a draft reply also. In many cases, we replied highlighting all of this, and also highlighting one more angle to say that under the provisions as they existed, there was no teeth available to the department officer to force you to pay a tax because of unmatched credit or because of unreconciled credits and ask you to reverse the credit. That is where the government thought that we need to bring in some teeth, and therefore they introduced Rule 36.4. This rule was introduced from 9th of October 2019. Earlier it had a 20% ITC restriction, and from 1st of January that 20% was reduced to 10%. So first point which we want to propose is that for periods prior to October 2019, of course, as the best practice, most of the organizations have kept on doing a 2A and a 3B reconciliation and are chasing the vendors. We are not saying you don't chase the vendors to make sure that there's an upload, but mere mismatch between 2A and 3B does not result in a consequence of reversal of credit for period prior to October 2019 is the first proposition which we would like to highlight. What happens post October 2019 is you have 36.4, wherein we are told that you are expected to do this matching on a month-on-month basis, and then find out the value of your eligible match credit. And then we are told you can claim that eligible match credit. You can claim the unmatched credit only to the extent of 20% of the eligible match credit. From January, only 10% of the eligible match credit. So therefore, there is now a cap of 10% on unmatched credit, and that 10% is to be calculated on the basis of eligible matched credit. Now, of course, as we know, This rule has various challenges, especially because there is no time dimension attached to it. The credits appear in 2A based on the invoice date uploaded by the supplier. The credit is claimed in 3B based on the date on which the invoice is booked in the books of accounts. And therefore, there is always going to be a timing difference. And therefore, what we do is we look at a cumulative count. And based on a cumulative count, if we are able to make sure that your unmatched credit is within the 10% restriction, then we claim the credit. If it was above 10%, then in those cases, case to case basis, we have deferred the claim of those unmatched credits. In some organizations, they would say that we don't want to go into so much of rigmarole. We will claim the credits only on the basis of actual matching, and they have kept all their unmatched credits in the deferred account, and they are waiting and they are chasing the vendors to make sure that they upload the credit in their respective 2As so that the credits can be claimed. Now, while this was there, we had this COVID coming up, which has resulted, as we discussed yesterday, in waiver of late fees for filing of GSTR1. Now, this results in a very peculiar situation where your 3B becomes prior to 1. And because 3B, there is a requirement of payment, and therefore you want to make the payment and file the 3B, but your vendors have still not filed GSTR1. The government has wisely thought about that situation, and therefore in the ordinance, they have said that the provisions of Rule 36(4) will cumulatively apply from the month of February onwards till September. It will cumulatively apply in the month of September. Therefore, in a way, Rule 36(4) has been kept in abeyance from February to August 2020 because of the COVID-19 scenario. And therefore, for these months, you can claim the credits as per the books without any implication. One question which comes is, if you have deferred the credits of the earlier period, either because you didn't want to claim unmatched credits at that point of time, or because your unmatched credits were about 10%, in those scenarios, you have a deferred credit account wherein there is a lot of deferred credit which has lying of the earlier months. Whether those earlier months deferred credit can be claimed, I would believe yes, you can claim the credit as of now, and of subject to the adjustment to be done in the month of September. And I would also believe, though these are early days, I would also believe that there is no interest which is required to be paid on these types of reversals of or adjustments which you are required to do in the month of September. But we will have to wait for further guidance on this front as time progresses. So this is on the reconciliation. To summarize the reconciliation aspect, as far as prior to September 19 is concerned, up to September 19, there is no legal backing. Of course, as a best practice, you should keep on doing that so that at least at the time of assessment, there is a proper matching which is available. After that, you have 36(9), which will operate up to the month of January. From the months of February, because of COVID-19, 36(4) again is in abeyance. And from September 20, it would still again become applicable, and there will be a tolerance limit of 10% up to which you will be eligible to claim the credit. These are the things from my side. I'm sorry, there was a bit of an interruption in between, and I had to log in again. And for the little bit of the speed which was there, I think we can now take up questions from the participants as they come in. Please feel free to put in your questions. There have been a few questions in the chat relating to the operational technical side of audio or video. Therefore, we'll skip that. I think the first question is coming from Visham Nevashya. If you have put a question before that, I'll request you to post your question. I will be taking from the questions in the chat window from Visham Nevashya's question onwards. So the first question which has been asked by Visham is, can we avail ITC on motor vehicle if this is bought for office use? The answer is no. Section 17(5) clearly restricts the credit of ITC if it is for self-consumption, and therefore you will not be eligible for credit. There's a question asked by a client, in branch transfer, do we need to pay tax within 180 days? The tax has to be paid on the day you do the branch transfer. The credit will be available immediately. What I highlighted was that the input tax credit reversal is not required in these types of scenarios. The next question is relating to e-invoicing, and the question is whether e-invoicing has been deferred. Yes, the e-invoicing as well as the new return format, both of them have been deferred up to October 2020. We have failures that perhaps based on the scenario, it might get deferred by a few more months from there also. So right now, the e-invoice as well as the new return format is no longer a priority for any of us, I would believe. Thereafter, the next question is, what would be the interest rate in case of reversal of credit, 18% or 24%? Now, in this scenario, in most of the provisions, they are talking about 18%. The 24% interest rate, which has been mentioned, is applicable in case of unmatched credit, but that provision itself is not applicable as of now. And therefore, in all cases, we would believe that the interest rate should be 18%. There's a question from Nanda Kishore. There's a lift which is fitted in an immovable manner in an immovable property. I would believe a lift would form a part of plant and machinery, and therefore input tax credit will be available. While I'm highlighting that the input tax credit is available, please note that the credit will be available in the ratio if you are providing both taxable as well as exempted supply. Whether ITC on scooter is available and bike is available because they constitute motor vehicles, the credit is not available for that. Whether pre-joining medical expenses will be allowed. The entry specifically says that medical insurance and health-related health services, the credit is not available, so you will not be eligible for these credits. There is a question which is relating to a real estate. It says in case of builders and developers, 1/3 land deduction will be considered for reversal under Rule 42. As far as real estate is concerned, they have given a very clear formula which is on the basis of area calculations, and therefore you will go for area calculations for financial year 1920 onwards. RCM is whether RCM is applicable on ocean freight. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Sir, next question is by Paresh. He says, can we use IGST credit against CGST and SGST liability? Yes, after adjustment of output IGST, you can use against your CGST and SGST liability in the manner in which you want. If you want it to be used 50-50, you can use it that way. You want to use it 30-70, you can use it that way. It is your choice how you want to adjust, but you still need to adjust it before you move to any other credit adjustment. The next question is from Nikunj. Courier outside India, can we claim ITC? Although in 2A, the state of supply is mentioned at others territory. In our view, the credit is eligible. I am aware that this credit does not reflect in your GSTR 9. However, that is a separate issue by itself, which can be debated. And I would believe that yes, the credit should be claimed by you. Next question is by Pankaj Parikh. Purchase is done by branch A. ITC is claimed in branch B. Is it available? The answer would be clearly no, because it's not appearing in the books of branch B. And also the invoice and the 2A matching, all of that would be relating to branch A. Therefore, one has to be very careful at the time of invoice booking. Make sure that you book your invoice in the correct states. Otherwise, you will be stuck with no credits in either of those states. Next question is asked by Visham Nevashya. His question is ITC on repairs of office premises. I already highlighted the 3 tests. When you are claiming repairs of office premises, you have to ask 3 questions. Whether the expense has resulted in an immovable property. If it is something like a furniture and fixtures or something which is movable, then you will immediately claim the credit because it is not immovable. Second scenario, situation which you have to ask is whether it has resulted in a plant and machinery. Something like an air conditioning equipment or a firefighting equipment would all be examples of plant and machinery, and therefore even that credit will be available. And third question which you have to ask is whether you are capitalizing or taking it to P&L account. If you are capitalizing, the credit won't be available. If you are taking it to P&L account, the credit will be available. The next question is from Vikas. He says GST invoice is valid for 1 year. Unable to understand why clients ask for current date invoice. Say original invoice is raised in January 20, but in March the client asks to submit a current date invoice in March 20. There is no impediment under the GST law. Many companies have their own whims and fancies. We cannot discuss the reasons why they would do that. I think if you look at the GST law, there is no impediment for a client to claim a credit in March 20 if the invoice is dated January 20. The next question is when a voucher is provided as a part of a promotional activity, will GST credit be disallowed? Now here when you look at that entry, the entry is subject to a little bit of an interpretation. It says when goods are disposed of by way of free samples or as gifts. Now the question is, when you are giving a voucher as a promotional activity, whether there is a disposal, aggressive view would be to say that there is no disposal. The entire prohibition applies only to assets which are destroyed or goods which are not having any functional utility. But something which has been a part of a promotional activity should be eligible for credit. That is one view. A conservative view would be to read that word free separately, and because you are giving a voucher free, therefore the credit should not be available. Depending on each client's risk appetite, the client should take an individual call on whether they would like to claim the credit or not. Next question is from Nikunj. Structures like stadiums, hotel roofs, can we claim ITC on inputs? I think the principles we have discussed, the three principles: immovable, immovability, capitalization, and plant and machinery. If you look at all the three tests, the description which you are giving perhaps would be in the nature of a civil structure which is capitalized. If that be the case, you will not be eligible for input tax credit. Next question again is somewhat similar from Atul. Eligibility of repair works of the canteen area. The fact that it is canteen really is of no relevance, but since it's a repair of a civil structure, you will again take it through that capitalization test and accordingly take a call. What type of reimbursement of GST in the restaurant industry? As I was highlighting, if you are only in the restaurant business, there's no question of claiming any credit. If along with restaurants you have other activities as well, in that case a proportionate input tax credit gets unlocked to you. Please talk to your respective partner in charge to get a clarity on it, or you may talk to me separately offline. The next question is from Devendra. Suppose my turnover is not exceeding 20 lakhs and I avail a GTA service. Do I need registration of GST for payment of RCM? Please reserve this query for tomorrow. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Next question is, if we give some materials to our contractor and deduct that amount from his bill, is there any GST impact? This is a chargeable material. This would be deemed as a supply, and therefore there will be a GST which you will charge as a sale of the material to the contractor. Please note that there's a technical difference between a chargeable supply and a free issue supply. If it's a free issue supply, then there is no GST implication. You might refer the cases of Bhayana Builders and NM Goyal and then take a call on this regard. The next question is from Ashok Verma. Whether ITC can be claimed on group Mediclaim insurance which is paid by the company? The answer is clearly in the negative. It cannot be claimed. The next question is from Samir. Whether ITC claimed on meetings and conference expenses of the company, if they are for the purposes of business, definitely the ITC can be claimed. Let's say if one of the salespersons is attending one of the marketing meetings or conferences, necessarily you can claim the credit. Next question is from Sudhir, which says whether the 180 days payment is applicable to import of service, although we pay RCM at the time of booking of the invoice. The answer is no. The 180-day payment test does not apply. I had highlighted this in one of my slides that it does not. For RCM, the 180 days payment test is not applicable. Next question is for Gaurav Dhumal. Office persons go to other state and the hotel charge CGST and SGST. Then we can take input tax credit or not. In this scenario, we have a bit of a challenge, especially for the state component, because the state of, assuming you are in the state of Maharashtra and your employee has traveled to the state of Gujarat and the hotel in Gujarat charges Gujarat SGST. The tax has gone to the Gujarat government. Because the Maharashtra government did not get the tax at all, we cannot expect the Maharashtra government to give you back the SGST credit. So there is a challenge over here of the claiming of the SGST credit. Since CGST and SGST go hand in hand, a conservative advice would be that both these credits should not be claimed. If it is an IGST, our answers may be a bit different as it was explained in the case of courier, but CGST, SGST will be a problem. Nand Kishore is again asking that question of major repair which is capitalized in a works contract. If it is capitalized, then necessarily you will not be eligible for credit if it is an immovable property and not amounting to plant and machinery. Next question is from Sudhir, wherein he is asking whether interest income is fully exempted. The answer is yes. On the output side, it is fully exempted, but please note that this will not be treated as a exempted supplies for the purposes of reversal of credit. Next question is from Ashok. Can we avail input tax credit of movable furniture bought for renovation of hotel rooms? Since it is movable, the credit should be allowed. It is not in the course of construction of an immovable property, and therefore the credit should be allowed for this. In building construction is in work in progress. We purchase the material for construction with GST. Can we take the credit, take in input credit, but the construction is capitalized after some years? Because ultimately the objective is to capitalize. I would believe that the credit should not be claimed at all on this example. ITC on interior designing for newly constructed property, we've already addressed Visham that question. Next question is from Aryan Kamdar. IGST in respect of import purchase is to be reversed if the importer is not paid within 180 days. On a plain reading of the provision, yes, this creates a problem. If the payment is not made within 180 days, there is a requirement of reversal in case of the credit of CVD IGST claimed on import of goods. Next question is again, I think from Darshita, which is a repeat question. So we will not talk about it, promotional activities and gift vouchers. Next one is from Devendra Bajaj, which says that ITC to be reversed at the rate of 5% attributable to non-business purpose. Is it a standard reversal? In our view, it is not a standard reversal. If and our position in most of the organizations is to say that all the activities of the company are in the course or furtherance of business. Wherever we find that there are examples of expenses which are not in the course or furtherance of business, we suggest a conservative route like CSR expenditure and not claiming the credit. And therefore, what we say is there's nothing which is common between business and non-business purpose, and therefore that 5% provision is not triggered at all. Next question is from Nikhil Solanki, wherein he said that a supplier has wrongly given credit in a different GST number and now is unable to amend. Can we claim credit in the correct GST number? Now, this is a problem because if he is unable to amend, I'm sure you are also unable to claim the credit because the due date for amendment and the due date for claiming the credit are the same. Therefore, you will always end up with a mismatch. And because the credit is in the wrong state, you would have missed the bus. And I don't think you should be getting the credit in any of the states. This will be a little bit of a challenge. Whether we can avail in credit of purchases like tires, repairs, etc. Because these are goods or services in connection with motor cars, which is an ineligible asset, even this credit will not be available at all. The next question is about our view on the recent Orissa High Court decision in the case of Safari Retreats, which is related, which has somewhere held in very peculiar facts that you are eligible for the credit of civil construction if you are a landlord and you are going to ultimately let out the property on rent when a commercial property on rent. The matter is pending in the Supreme Court, and I would believe that perhaps it's a little bit overstretched interpretation. A conservative view would suggest that we should not rely too much on that decision. Jayashri is saying that my 2A shows excess transaction which supplier raised on us, which is not pertaining to us. What should we do for such transaction? You don't need to do anything. Since it is not your transaction, you can't claim the credit. When you file your annual return, if applicable to you, this will appear as a lapsed credit, and that's all that happens to this. Nothing else needs to be done by you. Next question is from Sudhir. I am not clear of the question. It says URD bill now to be considered as exempt. Is it correct? I am not very clear of the question, so I cannot respond to it. Next question is by Visham. If we have partially paid to a vendor within 180 days and balance is still payable, can we still claim ITC on the entire invoice? On the first day, you will claim ITC of the entire invoice. On the 180th day, you will reverse the credit to the extent of the unpaid component. So proportionate reversal with interest will be required on the 180th day. Next question is from Darshita, whether GST credit will be ineligible for parking charges. I would believe that this credit should be available because there's no specific restriction on parking charges, and therefore there's no reason to disallow that credit. Vikas's question is on director's remuneration, RCM applicability. We'll discuss it tomorrow, Vikas. We have a very detailed discussion and a slide on that tomorrow. The next question is in case vendors put our tax amount in unregistered dealers into I assume that you are saying that vendor has paid the tax but has uploaded it in B2C column. In my view, up to September 2019, you are eligible for credit. Post September 2019, this amount will go in your unmatched basket and it will be eligible subject to the 10% condition, not beyond that. Whether credit is available of a truck for business movement, this credit is available motor vehicles which are used for goods transport. There's a very specific allowance of credit for that. Therefore, you should be eligible for credit. I think, Lokesh, that question is the last question which we have right now. And I think with that, if there are more questions, we can take them up, one or two more questions. The question is whether notification issued for builders for reversal of area is applicable for financial year 1920. The answer is yes, it is applicable for financial year 1920. As far as 1718 and 1819 is concerned, there has been a huge legal dispute on this. Under the service tax law, there is already a decision which says that the reversal is not required because there is no simultaneous grant of an exempted supply as well as a taxable supply, and therefore please take this question offline. It's a little bit complex. There have been contrary decisions on this, and depending on your risk appetite, you will have to take the view on this. The last question which we will try to take is from Vishal. He says, if my vendor files the return after receiving the payment, but we had claimed the ITC before that, then what will be the situation? If you have claimed the ITC after you received the tax invoice and after you received the goods, and thereafter the vendor has filed his return, I think there's no issue at your end. You can keep on claiming the credit. There is no challenge on that front. Next question is from Dabolkar, wherein he is asking whether repair expenses incurred for forklifts, cranes, etc., whether ITC can be claimed of such repair expenses. If the underlying motor vehicle is eligible for a credit, the repair expenses also will be eligible for credit. If the underlying motor vehicle is not eligible for credit, the repairs will not be eligible for credit. Next question is from Ashok Verma. If vendor is not willing to file his returns, can we claim full ITC on the basis of tax invoices issued by them? If he is not willing to file returns, then there's a problem. I presume he has not even paid his tax. If he has not paid the tax, then one of the conditions will be a problem. If he has filed a return and wrongly put it in B2C, you could still defend your claim of credit. But if he has not paid the tax, I think you cannot defend the claim of the credits. Clients who have put their questions on YouTube chat, I'll request them to please put the questions here, because it would not be feasible for us to go to YouTube and again put this that question once again over here. The question is from Darshita. IGST and imports should be claimed immediately post payment or post receipt of the hard copy of bill of entry. The law permits you to claim the credit immediately post the payment of the customs duty, because at that point of time the bill of entry is there. It might be lying with your custom house agent or your clearing agent. He is just your agent. It's as good as having received the bill of entry at your end, and therefore you should be eligible for credit on that day. However, many organizations would want to wait till the time the bill of entry is booked in your ERP and the GRN is posted in the ERP. In that scenario, depending on the organizational call, you might delay the credit. But legally, there is no restriction on the claim of credit at the time of the payment of the customs CVD itself. Next question is by Pradeep Shah. If March return is filed after 20th October, can ITC be claimed? This was missed. I did discuss this issue. This is a major issue which comes up in certain cases where you have delayed the return. And we believe that there is a strong ground to say that you cannot read section 16.4 in isolation. You will have to read it in the context, and the claim of credit should be the claim of credit in your books of accounts and reflection of that credit in the September return. Even if you have filed that September return late or that March return late, that should not disentitle you from the entire claim of credit. That is our view, and it's definitely a defendable case. I am aware that notices have been issued. If notices have been issued, we will have to defend it as and when the notices come up with the legal arguments on that front. I think that is all that we have time for, and I will try to address the questions. I wish you all a pleasant stay at home and stay safe. These are testing times, and please share your feedback on emails. We would be winding up this chat right away. Today we also had a YouTube live, and therefore this entire session has been recorded live and will be available on our YouTube channel. Incidentally, that YouTube channel also has many of our past recordings, and in this time where you might have some time available with you, maybe you might like to revisit some of those videos as well. Thank you. See you tomorrow again for the RCM related discussions. Thank you.